Hey everyone, Delve here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm going to cover the stat Luck in Dark Souls 3. On the surface, Luck seems like a relatively superfluous stat, predominantly affecting the drop chance of items from enemies. However, Luck does have some unique and interesting properties to it, making it a highly useful stat. So we'll start with the advantages, the biggest one being Anri Straight-Sword. Most stats have a distinct plethora of weapons that you gain access to via scaling and infusions, such as katanas with dexterity or maces with strength. Luck has no such category of weapons, and in fact no weapons in the game even display luck scaling. In spite of that, a single weapon in the game actually has ridiculous luck scaling, that of course being Anri Straight-Sword. The weapon can even also be buffed with resins or spells, which means that it never even falls off either. So Luck at the bare minimum has access to a highly exceptional weapon, essentially filling in for its various weaknesses. The next advantage is bleed and poison. Luck is a stat which increases the amount of bleed and poison buildup that a weapon deals. This is not actually particularly useful, especially against bosses, many of whom are resistant or immune to one or the other. Nevertheless, there are still plenty of enemies and some bosses weak to one or the other, and so they can still both manage to be useful. Bleed weapons and the bleed infusion in particular can be really useful against many enemies, since you can very easily get a big chunk of damage on them. Poison is much less useful, but it is still extremely effective against NPC type enemies, since it deals 7 damage per second against them, as opposed to most enemies and bosses who only take 3 damage per second. So both can be very situationally useful. And then lastly, of course, the increase in enemy drop chance via the stat called Item Discovery. Luck is actually the worst source of item discovery overall, as each point of luck is only equivalent to a single point of item discovery. Compare that to sources such as the Covetous Gold Serpent Ring, which provides you with a 100 item discovery, or the Crystal Sage's Rapier, which provides you with 50, but it is still an advantage that it's worth mentioning. Now onto the downsides. The biggest and the most obvious one is the Hollow Infusion. I think I said at some point that the worst infusion in the game is the Blessed Infusion, and it is a bad infusion, don't get me wrong, but it also somehow manages to be better than the Hollow Infusion, which is the actual worst infusion in the game. What the infusion does is cause a weapon to scale with your luck, and also gives you a bonus to your luck stat depending on how hollow your character is, which can be obtained from various NPC quests. That's all well and good in theory, but the actual scaling itself is fairly terrible, and it only scales up to 40 luck, at which point it hits a soft cap. Compare this to Anri Straight-Sword, which scales up just fine to 60 luck, just like most infusion types in the game. Even at 60 luck, a hollow infused weapon will barely outdamage a sharp infusion, even with extremely low dexterity. So, for example, Onigiri no Utabachi will deal as much damage with a hollow infusion at 60 luck as it deals with 25 dexterity and a sharp infusion. So obviously the hollow infusion just is not a great deal. Even with absurdly massive stat totals, say 60 strength, 60 dexterity, and 60 luck, hollow infusions still often fail to outdamage either the sharp or the refined infusion, and even when they do pull ahead of those infusions, it is usually fairly slight. If you do happen to have a freakishly high level character, technically a hollow infusion is the best infusion type for some weapons, although practically any investment in faith or intelligence will provide you with more value than luck in most scenarios. Similarly, I'll mention the blood and poison infusions here. These infusions are fine and can be used to massively boost a weapon's bleed or poison buildup, but the actual application for either of these are fairly hit or miss, especially poison. It doesn't help that these infusions prevent a weapon from being buffed with resins or spells, meaning they lose an extra layer of helpful damage that could have helped them maintain relevance. Even some enemies or bosses that are theoretically weak to bleed or poison aren't actually worth attempting to bleed or poison, which makes these infusions even more niche and hit or miss. And because of Anri Straight-Sword, these downsides end up being not so much of a big deal anyway, making luck actually a fairly decent stat overall, and I would compare it to dexterity and overall effectiveness. Okay, now onto the game progression. The obvious choice here is Thief, as they start with the most luck. Additionally, the Thief class starts with the Bandit's Knife, which is a superb weapon throughout the entire game, mostly. Not only is it a dagger that can easily stun lock some enemies, but the bleed damage makes it highly useful, especially early on in the game. A great example is against the Crystal Sage boss, as he is easy to stagger and quite weak to bleed. For this reason, it's actually a strong weapon for essentially any type of character, and that it can essentially carry you through a good chunk of the game, regardless of your stat distribution. And it can also be bought from Grey Rat too, so it's quite easy to get. The next weapon is Arstra's Spear, which can be obtained by trading in the Cursed Rod of Greatwood's Soul. Like all spears, this weapon is on the surface quite disappointing, but it is also the first poison weapon you can obtain in the game, and for that purpose it is actually quite powerful. I used this several times throughout the early part of the game to apply poison to NPC style enemies, Specifically, this weapon is by far the easiest way to consistently obtain Anri's straight sword early. Both Anri and Horus can be poisoned, and most NPC-style enemies are also extremely vulnerable to the spear moveset, which oftentimes can be used to poke them from outside of their attack range. Once the poison is applied, you can simply wait them out fairly easily. Now on to Anri's straight sword. The first thing to note about the weapon is obtaining it, and it can be obtained in one of two ways. The first is obviously by killing Anri and Horus, and this is the quickest way to obtain it. The main thing to note here is that you aggro them before talking to them in the Road of Sacrifices, as if you talk to them and then come back, they will have moved on to the next location. Alternatively, you can of course kill them later, such as when Horus abandons Anri in the Catacombs of Karthus. The other option is to obtain it by concluding Anri's questline, either by sacrificing him in Anor Londo for Yuria, or by defeating Aldrich with him by using a summon sign outside of Anor Londo. I don't actually recommend waiting to obtain it, as it is actually a highly useful weapon against some very annoying enemies. If you want to wait to obtain it, the Bandit's Knife is actually good enough to get you there, but you will want to obtain it one way or another at some point because it's very useful against endgame bosses. Talking about the weapon itself, it has some unique properties. First off, it counts as a blessed weapon, meaning that it gives you bonus health regen, and can be used to prevent skeletons from regenerating in the Catacombs of Karthus. Furthermore, the luck scaling is unique among weapons in general, as the scaling soft caps at 60 luck, as I already mentioned, compared to bleed buildup, poison buildup, and the hollow infusion, which only scale up to 40 luck. This means in practical terms that Anri's straight sword is essentially a necessity for a luck-based character for any boss that is immune or highly resistant to bleed or poison, as your only other option is the hollow infusion, which is comparatively poor. Lastly, Anri's straight sword upgrades with Twinkling Titanite, which makes it fairly easy to upgrade it all the way to +5 before Pontiff's Soul Vein, which is possible by obtaining every piece of Twinkling Titanite in the game, including the ones sold by Greyrat. For this reason, Anri's straight sword easily outstrips the Bandit's Knife in most situations, but against enemies such as Soul Vein beasts, the Bandit's Knife still does better. At this point, you have everything you need to beat the game, but there are still some interesting optimizations that can be useful against some bosses or in niche scenarios. So I'll start by talking about the blood and poison infusions again. These add or increase the bleed or poison buildup of a weapon, and it's especially good on weapons which already have either poison or bleed. It does reduce the scaling and base damage of the weapon, so these infusions are only ever going to be useful in situations where the enemy is weak to poison or bleed. In practice, this will rarely if ever outperform Anri's straight sword, but there are some weapons which are quite good when infused. I've already mentioned the Bandit's Knife, and it continues to be a solid option. Probably the best bleed weapon in the game is the Warden's Twin Blades, which are somewhat similar to the Sellsword's Twin Blades, except that they also bleed enemies. At the end of the game, this has one specific use case, that being against the Demon Prince boss, whose weakness happens to be bleed. Even when blood infused, the weapon is still fairly overpowered for what it is, and can be used effectively against a wide range of enemies as well. It can be obtained as a rare drop from the Grave Warden enemy, and I recommend farming it in the Untended Graves area. Ordinarily, I would not discuss rare drop weapons, because I don't really feel like they're usually worth obtaining, but since the luck stat boosts item discovery, I think it's somewhat appropriate in this case. As for the poison infusion, you also have some fairly good options. The first one I'll talk about is the Brigand's Twin Daggers. This is a weapon I probably should have covered in the Dexterity Guide, as it's a fairly good weapon that also excels with a Sharp Infusion. But it also does fairly decent with a Blood or Poison Infusion, given that it is an extremely fast twin weapon. I do highly recommend poison infusing it instead of blood, and the main reason being that the bleed procs from a weapon with innate bleed do more damage than a weapon without innate bleed. So the Brigand's Twin Daggers, in my opinion, will basically always lose out to the Bandit's Knife or the Warden's Twin Blade, but it is an interesting option just because it's the fastest twin weapon in the entire game. Another key option I recommend is the Crow Talons. These are extremely efficient when poison infused because you can use the weapon art to consistently gain hyper armor and rapidly poison NPC style enemies, even through shield blocks. I think this might actually be the single best poison weapon in the entire game, purely on that basis. You could also consider the Rotten Grue Spear, which of course drops off of the spear wielding Grues, such as the ones in Farron Keep. Not only does this weapon have a ton of poison buildup, but the charged weapon art also enables you to rapidly apply poison as well, so another really easy way to poison NPC style enemies if you want. And lastly, if you are interested in poisoning bosses like Gale, I highly recommend the Rotten Grue Dagger, which is a rare drop from the spellcasting Grue enemies, such as the one right next to the Halfway Fortress bonfire in Farron Keep. As a dagger, it is exceptionally easy to use, and it has more or less the highest poison buildup of any weapon in the game. Really, the only boss in the whole game worth poisoning is Gale, so the use is fairly limited, but it is still fairly effective against him. Your last option against bosses are poison arrows, which are somewhat effective against the old Demon King boss, but as a general rule, I don't recommend these. And lastly, I'll briefly talk about decent weapons for the Hollow Infusion. Like I said, this infusion is largely worthless, basically just a curiosity, at least in New Game. But with that being said, the weapon type which does the best with the Hollow Infusion are katanas. I used the Onigiri and Utabachi, and it was a little disappointing, but good enough to probably beat the entire game with. And you could probably do just fine with the Black Blade or the Uchi Katana as well. For a character with 60 strength, 60 dexterity, and 60 luck, katanas actually do significantly better with the Hollow Infusion than any other infusion type, including Sharp and Refined. But obviously I doubt, even with a character like this, that any katana would be better than a weapon like the Sellsword's Twin Blades. So I don't think it's really a super viable option in New Game Plus and stuff like that relative to Sellsword's Twin Blades, but I mean, it's an option. It's something you could consider. Anyways, onto your stat distribution. As usual, I highly recommend hitting 15 HP before anything else. And from that point forward, I recommend dumping any extra stat points you have into HP when you don't know where else to put your points. Having a lot of HP is really, really good in this game. Assuming you want to make use of Anri Straightsword, you'll obviously want to hit 60 luck. But if you are doing some kind of hybrid build, or you're not using Anri Straightsword, or you just want to maximize bleed damage, the obvious move is to stop at 40 luck, and then put your stats elsewhere. For rings, the one thing I want to mention here is Pontiff's right eye as well as Pontiff's left eye. These are especially good rings for any character using fast twin weapons or daggers, so consider them strongly. Otherwise, the typical options apply here. Ring of Steel Protection is a personal favorite, Covetous Silver Serpent Ring is another personal favorite, Estus Ring is just really objectively good, and Ring of Favor and Chloranthy Ring are both also really solid rings. Okay, and there's the luck guide. All in all, it's a decent stat, carried by a handful of exceptional weapons. Definitely stronger than any of the Spellcaster characters, and I'd say it was a decent amount of fun as well. Thanks for watching.